Bernie Sanders, we're just a couple of weeks away from the Iowa caucuses, and by most folks' accounts, ready to plunge into the political process, the process of electing a president here in the United States. You're mayor of Burlington, Vermont. From your perspective in that job, what kind of a person would you like to see as president of the United States?
Well, I would like to see somebody who has the guts to begin to stand up to the people who own this country, to recognize that in our nation today we have an extreme disparity between the rich and the poor, that elections are bought and sold and controlled by people who have huge sums of money. So my first concern is to have a president who has the courage to look reality in the face and say that we need some radical changes in this country so that every American can have the opportunity to have a decent standard of living and live a decent life. I also, when we talk about presidential politics, I always have a little bit of a problem because I'm not a Democrat and I'm not a Republican. In Burlington, Vermont, we have, I think, the only three-party system in the United States of America. My dream would be that we would have a strong third-party movement in the United States composed of working people and minorities and women groups and all of the people who are presently disenfranchised, though that doesn't exist right now. So my options are somewhat limited. But essentially, I would like to see somebody who speaks for the underdog, for the people who don't have decent health care benefits, somebody who understands that in America today 50% of the people don't even vote anymore, and the vast majority of that 50% are poor people and working people who have given up on the system. So essentially I would like to see a candidate who has the guts to have a vision that America could be a land for all people, not just the land controlled by the super rich.
She's a frequent guest on our show. I know she's a Washington socialite. In fact, I saw her last time I was here in Washington on the street, and a homeless guy came up to Georgette and said, "Please, I haven't eaten in 5 days." She said, "I wish I had your willpower."
And I really didn't grow up in a political family, and I didn't really become educated about politics until I went away to college. But then I did become involved in issues of war and peace and racial discrimination and so forth. And became involved way back in 1971 in Vermont politics, running on a third party. And I ran for governor and for senator on a total of 4 times, and I got 1% of the vote, and 2% of the vote, and 4% of the vote, and 6% of the vote, and finally, for a variety of reasons, I said, that's it. And I went about doing something else. And then back in 1980, some friends said, "Why don't you run for mayor?" And I said, "Burlington." I said, "Well, you're crazy." But they talked me into it, and I won by 14 votes, and then there was a recount that I won by 10 votes, and I've been re-elected 3 times since.
Here as an independent
See,
candidate.
you can never escape from home. So you go away, and what happens? You still get the questions. Okay. The answer is that I strongly believe that we need a third party in the United States of America, perhaps something akin to the new Democratic Party in Canada, a socialist-type party that would involve the unions, involve working people, basically a similar program to the Rainbow Coalition that Jackson is attempting to put together. We have done that in Burlington, Vermont. To some degree, we have, I think, the beginning of that effort in the state of Vermont. I ran for governor in 1986. I lost, but I got close to 15% of the vote, which is a good showing for a progressive third-party effort. In fact, it's I think, as good as anyone has done in modern history. I think the potential is there. The obstacles are enormous, because you need to build a party enormous sums of money, and almost by definition, a party of working people and poor people and minorities are not going to have that money. So to answer your question, I think it's possible. It's going to take long and hard, patient work. I think one of the areas that work could begin is on the local level. I would love to see cities throughout America emulate what we're doing in Burlington, having the guts to take on the Democrats and Republicans. You would be amazed, and I think the people would be amazed, at how little real support there is there for Democrats and Republicans. And if you stand up and you talk real issues and you try to represent real people, it is amazing how many people will come out and stand by you.
No, it just seems like conservative is in, and that's okay. I mean, a lot of people want to be conservative. It just seems that we've lost a little balance. I think that, like in 10 years, the word liberal is going to be synonymous with the word gay. People will go, you know, I'm a liberal. Oh, really? Maybe you should meet my friend Bob. He's a liberal.
Mayor Bernard Sanders of Burlington, Vermont,
How does a socialist like yourself keep winning elections in a country we generally consider that has a two-party system?
Well, I think we win in Burlington. I should point out that in Burlington, I am the mayor, and I've won on 4 occasions, but we have 13 people on our city council, our board of aldermen, and 6 of them are progressive, so it's not just me. We have probably the only strong 3-party city in the United States of America. And I think the reason that we win and continue to win is that increasingly people are frustrated and angry about a 2-party system which is dominated by big money and which does not pay attention to the needs of working people or elderly people or poor people. And I think if you talk common sense to the people and you say the government is supposed to represent the needs of those people who today are not getting a fair shake, you know what? They'll vote for you. And the problem that we have nationally in this country is that the 2-party system dominated by big money is not delivering for ordinary people, which is why people are giving up on the political process, why they're not voting, and why there is a great deal of anger and frustration at the political system as it now exists.
Well, anyway, I think a lot of people always mention politicians. They always mention the press as having a problem with those 2 groups. But they don't mention the people. They forget the fact that the people are also full of it a lot of the times. The people. They always say they want straight talk from the politicians, but they don't.
And I think the reason is that people perceive that government does not represent their interests. What difference does it really make? Michael Dukakis says, my campaign is about competence, not ideology. What he's really saying is, folks, there's not a whole lot of difference between the Democrats and the Republicans. You have a situation in the country today where 1% of the population owns over half of the wealth in this country. The richest 10% own over 83% of the wealth. In the last several years, we had a doubling of billionaires in this country at the same time as you have 3 million people sleeping out in the street. Last year, the chief executive officers of the largest corporations received a 48% increase in their take-home pay. The average American worker receives a 3 or 4%. Okay, 15% of our people have no health insurance. Who is addressing the issues that face the vast majority of our people? I think Congress, in a sense, no longer represents the ordinary people, and Congress is made up of the Democrats and Republicans. You know, people very often were yelling at the Republicans and Reagan, look at the horrible priorities he established, look at all the terrible things that he did to the poor people. But they forgot that both houses of the Congress for 4 out of Reagan's 8 years were controlled by the Democrats. So I think you have a bipartisan policy which essentially favors the rich at the expense of working people and the poor people. I think we need to go the direction of Canada, which has a 3rd party, Democratic Socialist Party. We may not win right away, but our job is to bring together workers and poor people, minorities, environmental groups, environmentalists. Let's come together, articulate the issues, and I think we're going to make some real progress.
I love the Canadians. I do. They're lovely people. They're our civilized neighbours to the north. In fact, before I emigrated to America, a lot of people in the old country said, why don't you go to Canada, Craig? A lot of Scottish people in Canada. I said, I know, that's kind of why I've made my choices. I'm going to be American. And to me, no disrespect to the Canadians, I love them, but to me, Canada, it's not the party, it's the apartment above the party. Do you know what I'm saying? Do you know what I mean? It's like, it's nice, it's good, it's well decorated, but it's the apartment above the party. I mean, we're down here all... And they're up there, can you keep the noise down? We're trying to be polite, we're nitwear up here, keep the noise down. And we're like, oh, come to the party, Canada. They're like, we weren't invited. We're like, Mexico wasn't invited, they came, come to the party.
I think you're raising a very important question, and that is one of the difficulties that one has in terms of developing a 3rd party in this country is dealing with a media which is increasingly dominated by large corporations. And it is no great secret that large corporations who own the newspapers, who own the television stations, who own the radio stations, are not terribly anxious to give a good hearing to viewpoints which challenge their economic interests. And that's really a basic problem that we're going to have to deal with.
Congressman-elect Bernie Sanders, independent, Vermont, at-large seat. In your former role as the mayor of Burlington, Vermont, you were in Washington many times and working on a variety of issues. What is it like coming here as a congressman-elect?
Well, it seems that it takes about 2 days to find out where the bathrooms are. It's, the bureaucracy is enormous, and what is being thrown at us, I think, necessarily is all kinds of information as to how you put together your office, how you make sure that you obey all the rules and you don't go to jail for taking gifts that you shouldn't take and all these other things. So it's, the first impression is an enormous amount of information that's being thrown at you. You're meeting all kinds of people. You're concentrating on trying to get onto the committees of your choice. In my case, there was a problem of whether or not I would be within the Democratic caucus or not, and that took a lot of work and effort. You're being bombarded, in our case, by at least several hundred people who would like jobs, by many people in the media who would like interviews. So it's been, to say the very least, an exhilarating and interesting week.
But I noticed listening to conversations, it's very much like show business. In fact, I heard two senators talking before, and one was saying to the other, "You're lying to me." The other one said, "Okay, but hear me out."
But I'll tell you honestly what I think the most important problem is, and where I want to play at least some role. And that is that the average American, to a significant degree, is giving up on government. To me, the major crisis that we face is that in this last election, as you know, about 60% of the people, when given the choice of the Democratic and Republican parties in Congress, didn't vote at all. You know, all of us are dismayed that in South Africa, for example, black people can't vote. How many of us know that in this country, poor people don't vote anymore? The last election, presidential election in 1988, you had 50% of the people not choosing to vote for Dukakis or Bush. You have a situation in this era of anti-incumbency. Throw the bums out. 96% of these guys got reelected. So the basic issue is how do you reinvigorate democracy? How to make the average working person, the elderly person, the poor person say, you know what, this is my government. Those people in Washington listen to me, they are representing my interest, and they're not just standing with the rich and the powerful against me. Now, how do you do that? That has to do with the media, who owns and controls the media. It has to do with the two-party system. It has to do with campaign financing and the fact that many of the candidates are heavily indebted to wealthy people and corporations who buy them, who buy politicians, who buy elections. So how we can begin the serious discussion, the national debate that we need, which says, where do we want to go as a country? Who has the power in this country? How do we democratize all of our institutions? How do we give working people power over their own lives? You know, we freed the slaves a long, long time ago, but in many respects, and I don't mean to be rhetorical about it, the average working person today has very little rights. Corporations announce a worker comes to work on a Friday, and the corporation says, oh, by the way, we're moving to Mexico. You worked for our company 30 years, here's a few bucks. You have no power to say, you don't have any power over your job. So I think the major challenge we face is not only a redistribution of wealth, which is important, but a redistribution of power, making the average American feel, this is my country, this is a democracy. I can shape the future. The people don't feel that now. They sit down, they watch the tube for 40 or 50 hours a week, they hold their nose, they vote for the lesser of two evils. Now that to me is the major problem, and once we can begin to deal with that problem, I think other things will follow.
But no, it's true, the race for president is truly on, and you know, everybody makes fun and criticizes, but it seems like everybody wants to be president, because here in Washington it's like sort of like being a sled dog. If you're not the lead dog, the view never changes.
Congressman Bernie Sanders, independent from Vermont, where does the United States stand after 1 week of war with Iraq?
Well, that's perhaps the first problem that we have to talk about, is that we don't know. And one of the reasons that we don't know is there has been in this war, as you know, an unparalleled degree of censorship that the government is now imposing upon reporters, and I have a real concern with that. It goes without saying that it is imperative that the media not expose American soldiers to loss of life through their reporting, but on the other hand, we happen not to be the government of Iraq or Saudi Arabia. We are a democratic society. And in a democratic society, the people have to know what is going on the most important issues facing them. Certainly this war is one of the most important things that's happened in this country in decades. So I have a deep concern that we don't have a whole lot of information. For example, one of the issues that has not been talked about is the number of civilians in Iraq who might have been killed. My guess is that the United States government is attempting to hit military targets and governmental targets. But given the enormous amount of bombardment, I cannot help but believe that when we're talking about 10 or 12,000 sorties, that you're talking about large numbers of civilians who have been killed. So to answer your question, I don't know. I think for those people who felt in the beginning that this would be a very quick 3-day war, clearly that's not going to be the case. I think right now probably the issue of the moment is President Bush contemplating fulfilling the resolution of the United Nations, which, as you know, was getting Saddam Hussein in Iraq out of Kuwait, or has the mission of this entire war effort changed so that we're now attempting to go into Iraq to destroy the political infrastructure of Saddam Hussein. If the latter is the case, and it appears that that decision may have been made by the president, are we as a people in agreement that that should be the mission? What are the costs attached to that new goal? The other day I was talking to a couple of former military experts. They made the estimate that if the United States wants to dislodge Saddam Hussein from Baghdad, they are estimating that it will cost us 40,000 casualties, including 10,000 dead. Okay. What are the implications of that? What are the long-term results of the United States now occupying Baghdad and Iraq in the midst of fierce Arab nationalism? Is that a position that we want to be? So I wish I could tell you more, but I can't.
Where do you stand on the use of force in fulfilling U.S. policy?
Well, I'll tell you, and I think we have all got to be very clear about this. What is happening at this moment is a terrible, terrible disaster for humanity. No ifs, buts, and maybes about it. One thinks about the children of our country and the world, watching missiles being lobbed from one country to the other, the nightmares, the fears that are developing, the nationalism, the hysteria that is being developing all over the world, the contempt for life that we're seeing all over the world. These are very, very terrible times. It's a major setback for the United Nations. My own feeling, my very strong belief, was that given the reality that virtually the entire world and the United Nations was united against a two-bit fascist dictator like Saddam Hussein, I refuse to believe today that that crisis could not have been resolved without this terrible war that we're seeing right now. That's what I believe. And I think, unfortunately, almost from the very beginning, President Bush was determined to use military force rather than diplomacy, and I regret that very much. I think given the reality that we're in the war right now, what I feel is that we've got to do two things. I think, first of all, now that American men and women are placing their lives on the line and are in terrible danger, clearly everybody has got to support our men and women in the armed forces and their families back home. And in fact, some of us in the Congress are now working on a bill to make sure that families back home whose husbands and wives are in the Army receive the financial support that they need. Second of all, I think that given the fact, and I know I'm amazed people disagree with me on this, but you know, we do happen to be a democracy. We have not yet given the President of the United States alone all responsibility for everything. And this whole process, I think the Congress has abdicated a lot of its responsibility. Now, I know the President in a war is the commander-in-chief. You can't have 535 people running the Army. I accept that. But the debate still has got to continue as to what our goals are and how we can resolve this horror with as little loss of life as possible. There's already been terrible loss of life. Where do we go from here is to try to resolve it with as little loss of life as possible. My own honest view at this point, and I think there are many who would disagree with me, is that if there is a possibility, and I'm not saying that there is, I really am not saying that there is. I have no inside information to believe that this is a possibility. But if it is possible that after the terrible battering that Saddam Hussein and Iraq and the people of Iraq have received over the last week, if there could be a short ceasefire, if you can have the Arab League and the United Nations quickly negotiating the withdrawal of Iraq from Kuwait, and if that could mean that we're not going to be looking at the loss of tens and tens or tens of thousands of American casualties, that's something that I could accept.
I was wondering how these big think tanks like the Trilateral Commission of Chicago and these big business and the big bankers are getting control of our Congress.
Well, they do that because, among other things, I mean, let me deal with two aspects of your question. First, you raised the question of think tanks, and that's an important issue. Very often, if you will turn on the commercial television, you turn on CBS or NBC, and they're talking about a problem, maybe it's taxation or whatever, and they say, now we want to hear from an expert on the issue, and we're going to go to the Enterprise Foundation or the Heritage Foundation. Well, what you find is, if you do a little research, is that many of these think tanks are bankrolled by large corporations. Now, the truth is there are occasionally some left think tanks as well. But most of the think tanks, who is able to put a lot of money into these quote-unquote experts and these professors who then tell us why we need to make the rich even richer in order to make the system work better. So that's the first problem. Second of all, the reason I think that big money is able to control both political parties, one of the important reasons, is that you have a campaign finance system which is beyond comprehension. Basically, when we talk about democracy, I think what most people mean is that you have candidates running for office and let the better man or woman win the election. It is totally absurd that we have a situation, and this is reinforced by a 1973 Supreme Court decision, which basically says that if I'm running against you and you're a millionaire, you can spend as much money of your own money in an election as I can spend. So you can outspend me 10 to 1, and you know what? You're going to win 95% of the time. That is not democratic. That is part of the philosophy which says money can buy anything. Well, frankly, I don't care if rich people buy big cars or big houses, but they should not be able to buy politicians, and that is what goes on right now. Now, that's the bad news. The good news is that the United States Congress did at least 50% of the right thing and recently passed halfway decent campaign finance reform legislation supported by Ralph Nader's group, supported by Common Cause, and what it said is that if you're running for the House or you're running for the Senate, most importantly, you have to limit the amount of money that can be spent in an election. That was a major step forward. But needless to say, the President of the United States, who was at last week, had a nice little dinner in which he raised, was it $10 or $11 million for himself and other Republicans. The President did not like this idea, and I can't understand why the President didn't like the idea, you know? Well, I guess maybe if I had a dinner and I raised $11 million from rich people, maybe also I would be opposed to limiting the amount of money that could be spent in an election. So to answer the gentleman's question, obviously the President will not support any real campaign finance reform because for him, the system is working very well. The rich are able to buy candidates. They're able to put tremendous amounts of money into elections. It's a great system for them. Working people and poor people, on the other hand, obviously can't afford to run for election because they don't have the money. So the reason you have a president who is what he is, he works for the wealthy people, they support him. It works pretty well. He protects their interest. Many members of the Congress do the same. The answer is real campaign finance reform, which limits the amount of money that can be spent and significantly puts public funding.
And I'm also delighted
elections.
that Secretary Reich was here, and I guess later Secretary Shalala is going to be here. And we have so many people who are coming together today to talk about how we can create a country and how we can create a government which represents all of the people for a change rather than just the rich and the very rich. And it's about time we did that. I think when one recalls the horrors of Reaganomics, the horror is not just the reality of what they have created, but rather it is their refusal to deal with the very difficult and burning issues facing our country. Some of you may remember that in 1984, when the guts of this country were being torn apart, when homelessness was growing, when the health care system was disintegrating, when the standard of living of American workers was declining, when more and more of our children were becoming hungry, when our infrastructure was collapsing, when leveraged buyouts were throwing workers out on the street, that's when we saw those lovely 30-second ads about mourning in America. Remember that? The lights were going out all over the country. The people were suffering, and the ads were telling us mourning in America. Things were getting better. Things were getting worse. And I'm delighted that at least, while I personally will have differences with President Clinton, at least there is now an acknowledgement of the severity of the problems, placing them on the table, and then let's begin to work together to solve them. But we can't solve them unless we acknowledge them. And what we have got to acknowledge is that Reaganomics was one of the great frauds in the history of this country, and we got to overturn it.
There are a lot of big issues here on the table here in Washington. Right now there's some debate in Congress about the FDR Memorial. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but there's some interest groups that are concerned with historical accuracy, and they're lobbying Congress. Some say FDR should not be in his wheelchair for the memorial. Some say he should be standing. Some say he should be having his cigarette. Some say not. Some say Eleanor's statue should not have fur on it. So they actually did a poll in USA Today on Friday, I guess to give Congress sort of a feel for how regular Americans feel about that issue, and the results are really interesting. 8% felt he should be in the wheelchair, 12% said he should be standing, and 80% said pass a budget. So.
But for many areas, in fact, we are going to need money to rebuild America, to feed the kids, to provide educational opportunity. Let's talk for a brief moment as to how, in a fair and progressive way, we might raise that money. Now, others have already talked about that. Congresswoman Velasquez, Secretary Reich, but let me briefly go over some facts. During the 1980s, as you all know, while the standard of living of American workers declined, the very richest people became much richer. According to a 1991 study, listen closely to this one, tax cuts for the richest 1 million American families, and that's people whose incomes averaged a mere $675,000 apiece, low-income families. Those people between 1978 and 1992, they, as a result of the tax cuts that they received, added $1 trillion to the national debt. $1 trillion in tax cuts. The same study found that the same 1 million families, the richest people in America, pay 30% less of their incomes in taxes than they would have had the 1977 tax code remained in existence. So what does that tell us when we look for funding for feeding hungry children, for putting people into affordable housing? It means to me that the time is now, in a very strong way, to say to the wealthiest people in this country, they're going to have to start paying their fair share of taxes. And that means, to my mind, going much higher than raising the income tax rate from 31 to 36%. It means, among other things, we should go higher than that. It means that we must create a progressive corporate tax rate. It means we must be prepared to do away with much of the tax deductibility for business meals and entertainment. Some of our friends who were able to write off going to the country clubs are going to finally start having to look at the hungry children on the sidewalk as they go to the country club and maybe pay a tax on that. And it means doing away with the tax breaks that now exist to help companies acquire runaway plants and move out of the country. And also, I think that the time is right that we even may have to contemplate going beyond just an income tax and talk about a tax on wealth. I think that that's appropriate as well. Secondly, when we talk about how we're going to raise the money that we need, it is absolutely imperative and impossible not to look at the bloated military budget. I think very few people have illusions that the world we're living in now is wonderful, is perfectly safe, that we should disarm America. Nobody thinks that. But on the other hand, there is some excellent news. The fact of the matter is that the Cold War is over. Our longtime adversary, the Soviet Union, does not exist. Russia wants to join NATO. Russia has significantly cut down on their military spending. Walesa is no longer in jail in Poland. He's the president of the country. East Germany is no longer threatening West Germany. It is part of West Germany, and so forth and so on. In my view, and the view of people who know more about this than I do, this country today can very safely reduce military spending by 50% over the next 4 years and use those hundreds of billions of dollars in freed up money to reinvest in America and to deal with the deficit. Let me also touch very briefly, when we talk about how we are going to acquire some money, it's always a funny thing, you know. When we need money for hungry children, When we need money to create productive jobs, they always tell us there's not money available. But you know what? When they wanted a war in the Persian Gulf, no problem, plenty of money available. And let me tell you someplace else where there's always money available. In the next couple of months, unless I'm very mistaken, President, Democrats, Republicans are going to come before the people and say they need another $40 or $50 billion to bail out the savings and loan industry. Another $40 or $50 billion. Now, I happen to think that with all of this talk about the deficit and how we may have to ask senior citizens to take cuts in COLAs and raise middle-income taxes and gas taxes and so forth and so on, everybody is so concerned about the deficit, then why the hell are we dumping another $40 billion into the deficit to bail out the savings and loan industry? Make sense to anybody here? All right. So I think that there are fairer and more progressive ways to deal with the S&L bailout than to dump it into the deficit.
Well, it's tough having an economic policy, I know, but the people don't seem to want to hear the truth. Remember, in the 80s, we said they could cut taxes, raise defense spending, and balance the budget. And George Bush himself said that's voodoo economics, and everybody went, voodoo economics? Let's give it a try. I mean, the name of the plan was actually trickle-down economics. Trickle down. They're actually saying, we're pissing on you.